The frost-bound air gripped the highway like a specter's fingers, silent, cold, and unyielding. I drove my truck through the suffocating stillness of Frostbite Pass, a lonely stretch of road where legends whispered louder than the wind. The snow fell with eerie precision, layering the ground in a ghostly shroud. The radio's static mingled with the rhythmic squeal of tires on ice, the only companions I had as night deepened and solitude pressed like an icy vice upon my chest. It was then I saw him. A lone figure, illuminated by the dim glow of my headlights, stood on the shoulder of the highway. His frame was gaunt, his clothes tattered, and his face shadowed by the brim of an old hat that seemed older than the road itself. He raised a trembling hand in a gesture both desperate and commanding, his breath coiling like a spirit into the frigid air. Something about him unsettled me, yet a sense of obligation outweighed my unease. No one survived these elements for long, and leaving him there felt akin to murder. I stopped. The man approached with deliberate slowness, his boots crunching against the brittle crust of snow. As he climbed into the truck, the cab seemed to grow colder, the air inside more oppressive. His face, pale as the snow outside, bore the look of a man who had lived 100 lifetimes of hardship. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice thin and rasping, like the sigh of wind through a hollow tree. "Where are you headed?" I asked, though my voice faltered against the unnatural silence that followed his words. "Just down the road," he replied, a peculiar glint in his eye. "But not too far." We drove in near silence save for the occasional creak of the truck and the persistent howl of the wind outside. Yet his presence seemed to fill the space, pressing against me, though he hardly moved. "Not many folks brave this road in December," he said suddenly, his voice slicing through the stillness. "You must have a strong heart, or perhaps no sense of fear." I forced a laugh, though it sounded hollow. "Just doing my job. Gotta deliver this load before Christmas." "Ah," he said, leaning back against the seat. "This road has claimed many lives, you know. Frostbite Pass is notorious for it. Families torn asunder, lovers frozen in time, travelers lost forever." I stiffened, my grip tightening on the wheel. "Yeah, I've heard the stories. Don't pay much mind to 'em, though. Folks like to exaggerate." "Oh, but they are true," he whispered, his words laced with something between sorrow and malice. "Every soul taken by this road lingers here, bound to the ice and snow. Do you feel it? The weight of their despair?" A chill crept up my spine, and I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye. He stared ahead, his gaze piercing the darkness as if he saw something beyond the reach of mortal sight. "I lost my family here," he said, his tone suddenly laden with grief. "Many years ago. A night much like this one. Cold. Unforgiving. The snow came down in waves, blinding, suffocating. Our car skidded and we—" He trailed off, his voice quivering like a candle's flame before extinguishing. "I'm sorry," I said reflexively, though a gnawing sense of dread was rooting itself in my gut. He turned to me then, his pale eyes glinting like shards of ice. "Would you like to know how it feels?" The question hung in the air, heavy and sinister. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached, but I said nothing. The headlights flickered. The engine groaned. The truck seemed to struggle against an unseen force, and the road ahead stretched endlessly, the darkness swallowing the horizon. "Many think they can escape this place," he continued, his voice now carrying an edge of malevolence. "But the past does not forget, and it does not forgive." A memory surfaced then, an old news story about a family who had vanished on this road decades ago. A father, mother, and their child, all lost in a blizzard. Their car had been found, doors wide open, but no bodies ever recovered. The pieces clicked together, and my breath hitched. "Who are you?" I demanded, though I already knew the answer. He smiled then, a ghastly grin that revealed teeth too sharp, too white, too unnatural. His face seemed to blur and shift, like a reflection on rippling water. "I am what this road has made me. A memory, a warning, a harbinger. You were kind to stop, and for that, I will spare you. For now. The truck shuddered violently, and I slammed on the brakes. The tires screamed against the ice, and the vehicle skidded to a halt. When I turned to face him, the passenger seat was empty. The door was still locked. I stumbled out into the freezing night, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The snow was untouched, no footprints leading away. Only the sound of the wind keening like a mourning widow broke the suffocating silence. Shaking, I climbed back into the cab and floored the accelerator, desperate to leave Frostbite Pass behind. The road seemed to twist and writhe, the shadows thickening as if the night itself sought to claim me. When I finally reached the next town, the warmth of the gas station lights felt like a reprieve from hell itself. I staggered inside, my hands trembling as I recounted the encounter to the attendant. He listened with a grim expression, nodding slowly. "You're not the first to meet him," he said. "Every December, someone picks up that hitchhiker. Folks say he's looking for his family, but he's been dead for 30 years. A photograph on the wall caught my eye then, an old black and white image of a man standing beside a car, his face unmistakable. Beneath it, a caption read, "In memory of the Frost family, lost to Frostbite Pass, December 1973. I left the station without another word, the chill of the highway still clinging to my skin. Even now I avoid Frostbite Pass, but the memory lingers, an icy shadow in the corner of my mind, a voice whispering from the darkness. The past does not forget, and it does not forgive." In the desolation of December, where the breath of nature seems held hostage by the frost, I found myself traveling the infamous Frostbend Curve. This stretch of road, marked by countless tragedies, had long been whispered about in tones of dread. Its name alone carried a peculiar weight, invoking tales of wailing spirits and an unseen malice lurking within the ice. Despite the warnings, necessity drove me onward, though every instinct begged me to turn back. The air was bitter, the kind that bites not just at the flesh but at the soul. The road gleamed under the moonlight, slick with a treacherous sheen of black ice, indistinguishable until it was too late. My old car groaned under the strain of the cold, its tires fighting a losing battle against the gripless surface. The solitude of the journey weighed on me, the stillness broken only by the occasional gust of wind that whispered through the trees like the sigh of a mourning widow. Then it began. At first it was but a faint sound, barely discernible beneath the groaning protests of my vehicle, a whisper, soft as the stirring of snow. I dismissed it as the product of my anxious mind, frayed by tales of this cursed road. Yet, as I rounded the curve, the whisper grew louder, clearer, until it formed a single, chilling word. Stay. My breath caught, the word curling like smoke around my ears. I peered into the darkened expanse beyond the windshield, but there was nothing, only the oppressive blackness of the night and the glistening sheen of the ice. Stay, the voice repeated, now more insistent. The car lurched violently as if something unseen had seized it. The tires skidded, the steering wheel jerking in my grasp as the vehicle slid sideways across the cursed ice. My heart thundered in my chest as I fought to regain control, my panicked breath clouding the frigid air. Suddenly the car halted with a jarring thud. I sat frozen, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. In the suffocating silence that followed, the whisper came again, closer now, almost intimate. Stay. I turned sharply, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror. In its cracked reflection, I saw nothing but the darkness, yet I felt an unmistakable presence. The air inside the car grew colder, and a thin frost crept along the edges of the windshield. My breath turned to mist, swirling in patterns that seemed to mock me, spelling out shapes that vanished as quickly as they formed. And then I saw it. A figure, pale and indistinct, emerged from the shadows. It stood motionless in the center of the road, its outline barely distinguishable against the frost-covered landscape. Cloaked in darkness, its features were shrouded, yet its eyes burned with a ghastly light, piercing and unrelenting. I tried to move, to turn the key and escape, but my body felt bound, paralyzed by an invisible force. The figure raised an arm, long and skeletal, and pointed toward me. "You cannot leave," it whispered, the voice now coming not from outside but from within my very mind. A scream clawed its way up my throat, but no sound escaped. My vision blurred as a sudden cold enveloped me, sharper than any winter wind. The frost that had crept along the windows now encased the interior of the car, a crystalline prison that encroached with every passing second. The figure began to move, its steps deliberate, each one resonating with a dreadful finality. Though it never opened its mouth, the whisper continued, rising to a crescendo that filled the car with an unbearable cacophony. "Stay, stay, stay." I slammed my hands against the steering wheel, desperate to break free from the icy grip that held me. Summoning every ounce of willpower, I turned the key, and the engine sputtered to life. With a deafening roar, the tires spun against the ice, and the car lurched forward, breaking free of its frozen bonds. But the figure was not gone. It kept pace with the car, gliding effortlessly across the ice, its burning eyes fixed upon me. The road twisted and turned, yet no matter how I swerved or sped, it remained by my side, a ghostly shadow that refused to relent. The whispers grew louder, transforming into anguished cries, as if the spirits of the damned themselves were calling out to me. Faces began to materialize in the frost-covered windows, pale, hollow-eyed visages that pressed against the glass, their mouths moving in silent pleas. "Stay," they mouthed in unison. I could no longer distinguish reality from nightmare. The road stretched endlessly before me, an unbroken expanse of black ice that seemed to mock my futile escape. The figure loomed closer, its skeletal hand reaching for the door. With a sudden jolt, the car broke through the icy barrier. The road beneath my tires became rough and uneven, the frost dissipating as I approached the edge of Frostbend Curve. The whispers ceased, replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow worse. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the figure, but there was nothing. Only the empty road behind me, its surface shimmering like a frozen tomb. I did not stop until I reached the nearest town, the bright lights of the gas station piercing the darkness like a beacon of salvation. Trembling, I stumbled out of the car and into the warmth of the station. The attendant, a grizzled old man with eyes that seemed far too knowing, took one look at me and nodded solemnly. "You were on Frostbend Curve?" he said, not as a question but as a statement of grim certainty. I nodded, my voice failing me. "You're lucky to be alive," he continued. "Not many make it past the stalker." "The stalker?" I managed to choke out. "A spirit or something worse," he said, his gaze fixed on the frost clinging to my coat. "It doesn't want you to leave. Every December it claims more souls for its icy grave." I stared at him, my heart pounding as his words sank in. Outside, the wind howled once more, carrying with it the faintest whisper. "Stay." Though I escaped Frostbend Curve that night, the memory remains, a chilling reminder of the thing that dwells there, waiting patiently for its next victim. Even now, as the frost gathers on my windows and the wind whispers through the trees, I cannot help but wonder if the stalker is still watching, biding its time until I return. The night was a tapestry of despair, embroidered with the howling cries of the storm that ravaged Frostwind Pass. My journey through this desolate wilderness had been fraught with unease, a feeling that gnawed at the edges of my reason like a persistent vermin. The snow, relentless and unforgiving, fell in great suffocating drifts that cloaked the world in a pall of cold oblivion. I had ventured too far from the town, lured by the promise of a shortcut through this accursed stretch of road. As the storm raged with an unholy fervor, I realized too late the folly of my ambition. The road, hidden beneath a sheet of glistening ice, offered no path forward. My vehicle, a sturdy beast in the best of conditions, shuddered and came to a reluctant halt. The engine sputtered and died, leaving me stranded in a void of white. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the mournful wails of the wind as it lashed against the windows. Panic clawed at my throat, but I forced it down, reasoning that shelter could not be far. Yet, as I stepped into the frigid abyss, I felt an intangible weight press upon my spirit, as though unseen eyes bore witness to my plight. I trudged forward, the icy needles of the storm biting into my flesh. It was then that I saw them, a family, their figures faint and wavering against the tempest. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, led the group, his arm around a woman whose fragile frame bent against the wind. Beside them, a small child clung to the woman's skirts, his tiny face obscured by the shadow of a hood. Relief surged through me, warming my frozen veins. "Good evening," I called, though my voice was nearly swallowed by the storm. "Do you know of a place where we might find shelter?" The man turned toward me, his movements deliberate, almost mechanical. The snow seemed to part around him, as though unwilling to touch his form. His face, oh, how I shall never forget it, was pale as alabaster, with eyes like hollow wells, their depths immeasurable and void of humanity. "Follow us," he said, his voice soft yet commanding, resonating with a strange cadence that chilled me more than the storm itself. They led me through the snow, their steps silent against the frozen ground. I followed, though every fiber of my being screamed against it. At last, we arrived at a small cabin, its frame crooked and battered, as though it had been abandoned to the mercy of the elements long ago. The windows, coated with frost, glowed faintly, and smoke curled from the chimney, a strange contradiction, for the place seemed devoid of life. The man opened the door and gestured for me to enter. Hesitating, I crossed the threshold into a room that smelled faintly of damp wood and something else, something metallic and acrid. The fire in the hearth burned low, casting flickering shadows that danced across the walls. "You must be cold," the woman said, her voice trembling yet kind. She gestured for me to sit near the fire, and I obeyed, grateful for the semblance of warmth. The family settled around me, their movements eerily synchronized. The child sat upon a small stool, his face hidden beneath the shadows of his hood. "Thank you," I murmured, though the words felt strange in my mouth, as though I were speaking them in a dream. "You saved me." The man inclined his head but said nothing. The silence stretched, thick and oppressive, broken only by the crackle of the fire. At length I spoke again. "Do you live here alone? The storm is treacherous. Surely others seek refuge nearby." The woman's eyes flickered toward the man, as though seeking permission to speak. He nodded almost imperceptibly, and she turned to me with a sad smile. "This cabin was our haven," she said, her voice tinged with melancholy. "We lived here many winters ago, before the storm came." My curiosity piqued. I leaned forward. "The storm?" "It came without warning," she continued, her gaze distant. "The snow fell for days without end, and the cold seeped into our bones. We waited for it to pass, but it never did. Supplies dwindled, and despair crept into our hearts like a thief in the night." The man spoke then, his voice low and measured. "We perished in this very place, our souls bound to the ice and shadow. Each winter, we linger, awaiting travelers such as yourself, to share our tale and warn them of the pass's curse." A chill ran down my spine, and I laughed nervously. "Surely you jest. You're as alive as I am." The child raised his head then, and my breath caught in my throat. His face, oh, the horror of it, was sunken and ghastly, his eyes dark voids that seemed to pierce my soul. "We are not alive," he whispered, his voice echoing with a dreadful finality. "And soon, neither shall you be." I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. The family rose in unison, their forms shifting, becoming more shadow than flesh. The fire dimmed, and the room grew impossibly cold. "Do not fear," the man said, his tone soothing yet sinister. "You will not suffer. The storm will claim you as it did us, and you shall join us in eternal repose." "No," I cried, backing toward the door. My hand found the doorknob and I wrenched it open, plunging into the storm once more. The snow swirled around me, blinding and relentless. I stumbled forward, the sound of their whispers following me, growing louder, more insistent. "Stay," they chanted, their voices weaving together in a dreadful harmony. "Stay with us." The trees loomed like skeletal sentinels, their branches clawing at the sky. The wind howled, carrying with it the mournful cries of the lost. I ran, though my legs felt leaden, my breath freezing in my lungs. At last I saw the faint glow of headlights in the distance, a vehicle approaching on the main road. Summoning my remaining strength, I waved my arms and shouted, my voice barely audible over the storm. The car stopped, and a man stepped out, his face etched with concern. "You're lucky to be alive," he said, as he helped me into the warmth of his vehicle. As we drove away, I glanced back at the cabin, now barely visible through the snow. The family stood in the doorway, their forms fading into the shadows. The child raised a hand as though bidding me farewell, and I shivered, the memory of his hollow eyes seared into my mind. To this day, I cannot forget the frozen shadows of the lost family, nor can I escape the feeling that I left a piece of myself behind in that cursed cabin. Each winter, when the snow falls and the wind howls, I hear their whispers once more. Stay. In the bleak solitude of December, the icy veil of winter blanketed the world in a deathly silence. I had been conscripted reluctantly to join a convoy, a procession of travelers and traders daring to traverse the infamous Frostvale Pass. The road, etched into the mountain's frozen spine, was a treacherous serpent that had claimed more lives than could be counted. Yet driven by necessity, we set forth, a fragile chain of life strung against nature's abyss. The storm began as a mere whisper, a faint murmur in the frigid air. By the time we reached the heart of the pass, it had become a wailing fury, a tempest that seemed alive with malevolent intent. The snow swirled in blinding currents, devouring the trail and shrouding the convoy in an impenetrable white darkness. Our caravan consisted of 6 vehicles, their headlights cutting feeble paths through the storm. I occupied the middle car, a vantage that provided both safety and isolation. My fellow travelers were but silhouettes in the rearview mirror, faceless figures rendered indistinct by the tumult. Though the storm was deafening, a dreadful silence hung between us, a tacit acknowledgement of the pass's dark history. As we pressed onward, an unease settled over me, a sensation both inexplicable and undeniable. It was as if the storm itself bore witness to our journey, its winds howling not in rage but in warning. It was subtle at first. The lights of the rearmost car flickered, their glow fading into the storm's abyss. I thought it a trick of the snow, a momentary obscuration by nature's hand. But when I glanced again, the car was gone, its absence a gaping void in the chain that bound us. I radioed to the lead vehicle, my voice trembling with alarm. "Did anyone see what happened to the last car?" Silence answered me, broken only by the crackle of static. Then the leader's voice, grim and uncertain. "Must have fallen back. Keep moving. We can't stop now." Reluctantly, I obeyed, though the unease gnawed deeper. Minutes passed, or perhaps hours. The storm twisted time into an unrecognizable tangle. And then, another car vanished. This time it was one ahead of me. Its red taillights blinked once, then faded as if swallowed whole by the storm. Panic surged, and I gripped the wheel until my knuckles ached. "2 cars are gone," I shouted into the radio. "They just disappeared." The leader's voice returned, clipped and strained. "Stay together, eyes forward, don't stop for anything." The storm thickened, and the world outside the windshield became a void, a howling, formless expanse. My car's engine labored against the snow, the headlights illuminating nothing but swirling chaos. Yet, in the corner of my vision, I saw movement. At first, I dismissed it as the erratic dance of snowflakes. But as I peered closer, I discerned shapes, vague, shifting figures that seemed to drift alongside the convoy. They moved with unnatural grace, gliding over the snow without disturbing its pristine surface. "Do you see them?" I whispered into the radio, my voice barely audible. "See what?" came the reply, tinged with the brittle edge of fear. "The shadows. Outside the cars." No response followed, only the oppressive crackle of static. The figures drew closer, their outlines sharpening against the storm's pallor. They were humanoid, yet grotesquely elongated, their limbs stretching unnaturally as they reached toward the cars. The vehicle ahead of me swerved violently, its tires skidding against the ice. A scream echoed over the radio, sharp and guttural, before cutting off abruptly. The car veered off the road and disappeared into the abyss below, leaving no trace but a fading echo. Now, only 2 cars remained, mine and the leader's. The lights of the lead vehicle flickered like a dying flame, its form barely visible through the storm. My radio crackled, and the leader's voice broke through, frantic and disjointed. "They're here, they're all around us." "Who?" I shouted, my voice raw with desperation. "The ones who were lost. They come back every winter." The leader's voice dissolved into static, and moments later, his car vanished. Its lights blinked out like a candle extinguished by a cruel wind. I was alone. The storm pressed against the car, a suffocating cocoon of ice and shadow. The figures surrounded me now, their faces hidden beneath hoods of frost. I could feel their presence, oppressive and insidious, as they pressed against the windows, their long fingers tracing patterns in the frost. Hay whispered my name. Panic overtook me, and I floored the accelerator, the tires spinning uselessly against the ice. The car lurched forward, but the shadows followed, gliding effortlessly alongside. Their whispers grew louder, a cacophony of despair that drowned the storm. I saw their faces then, gaunt and hollow, their eyes voids of unending darkness. They were the lost travelers of Frostvale Pass, bound eternally to the storm that had claimed them. Their mouths moved in silent pleas, their words stolen by the wind. One of them stepped in front of the car, its form solidifying into a figure I recognized. It was the leader of the convoy, his face twisted with anguish. He raised a hand, and the car skidded to a halt as if seized by an invisible force. "You cannot leave," he whispered, his voice resonating within my skull. "You belong to the past now." I screamed, wrenching the wheel to no avail. The shadows closed in, their forms merging with the storm until I could no longer distinguish one from the other. When I awoke, the storm had ceased. The sun hung low in the sky, its feeble light reflecting off the unbroken expanse of snow. My car was buried up to the windows, its engine long dead. I stumbled out, my limbs heavy and numb, and found myself alone in a world that felt untouched by life. I wandered until I reached the edge of the pass, where a rescue team found me days later. Their faces were etched with disbelief as I recounted my tale, but their questions confirmed the truth I feared most. The convoy had never been found. No wreckage, no bodies, nothing but the faint traces of tire tracks that vanished into the snow. Even now, as I sit by the fire, I feel the chill of Frostvale Pass in my bones. I see their faces in every shadow, hear their whispers in every gust of wind. The storm calls to me still, a siren's song laced with promises of reunion and despair. For once the past claims you, it never truly lets you go. It was a night of profound and desolate stillness, the kind that stirs unease in even the stoutest of hearts. The frost clung to the road like a ghostly shroud, its crystalline grip rendering the asphalt beneath an indistinct mirror. The stars above seemed veiled in sorrow, their light fractured and dimmed by the swirling breath of the storm. My journey, solitary and ill-advised, carried me through the desolate stretch of Frostvale Highway, a place whispered of with unease by those who had no reason to speak otherwise. The hum of the engine, though steady, could not dispel the oppressive quiet that hung in the air. It was a silence not born of peace but of expectation, as though the world itself held its breath in dreadful anticipation. The road was barren save for my lone vehicle, its headlights carving futile paths through the snowstorm's relentless dance. The frost crept up the windows, its delicate tendrils forming patterns that seemed almost purposeful, almost alive. And then, there it was. The vehicle stood in the center of the road, its presence sudden and unnatural, as though it had materialized from the swirling snow. Its form was stark against the pale backdrop, a black sedan, coated in a thin sheen of frost that glimmered in the weak light of my approaching beams. The car's engine was silent, its windows opaque with ice, and yet its driver's door hung slightly ajar, a mute invitation into its frozen silence. I slowed my own car to a cautious halt, the tires crunching against the icy surface. My breath fogged the air as I stared at the scene before me, an inexplicable sense of foreboding curling in my chest. Logic dictated that I investigate. Perhaps the driver had abandoned the vehicle in search of help, or worse, succumbed to the merciless cold. Yet something deeper, something primal, whispered for me to continue driving. The storm howled as I stepped from the car, the wind biting through my coat and sinking into my very bones. Each step toward the abandoned vehicle felt laborious, the snow beneath my boots crunching in unnatural rhythm, as though the sound itself sought to drown out the whispering warnings in my mind. When I reached the car, the frost-coated windows betrayed no hint of the interior. I leaned closer, my gloved hand brushing away the ice to reveal the glass beneath. What I saw inside made my blood freeze faster than the storm ever could. Handprints. They were faint but undeniable, etched into the frost from within, as though pressed in desperation or supplication. The smudges formed no clear pattern, yet the sheer number of them, small, large, overlapping, spoke of something frantic and unrelenting. I stepped back instinctively, my heart hammering against my ribs. The driver's seat was empty. The passenger seat was empty. No one was inside, and there were no footprints leading away. I stumbled back, nearly slipping on the icy road. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the labored rhythm of my own breath. The storm seemed to press closer, the wind wrapping itself around me like unseen arms, carrying whispers that I could not understand but which filled me with unspeakable dread. I turned toward my car, desperate to flee. But something stopped me. A sound, faint at first but growing clearer, emanating from the abandoned vehicle. It was a tapping, rhythmic and deliberate, as though someone, or something, was rapping against the inside of the frosted window. I turned back, compelled by a terror I could not ignore. The driver's door swung open. It did so slowly, its hinges creaking in protest, though the force behind it was invisible. The interior of the car was cloaked in shadow, yet it radiated an icy presence that seemed to sap the warmth from the air around it. I could feel it watching me, though no eyes were visible, no figure discernible within the gloom. My feet refused to move, as though the frost had crept up through the soles of my boots and bound me to the ground. "Help me," a voice whispered. It was soft and fractured, a threadbare plea that seemed to come from the depths of the car's shadowed interior. It carried with it a weight of sorrow so profound that for a moment my fear was eclipsed by pity. I took a step closer, my breath hitching as the frost beneath my feet crackled like shattered glass. "Help me," it whispered again, more insistent this time. I peered into the open doorway, my heart pounding with the force of an approaching storm. The handprints on the windows seemed to pulse, their edges shimmering as though alive. The darkness inside shifted, and for a brief moment I thought I saw movement. A figure, faint and translucent, slumped against the seat. Its face was turned toward me, its features obscured by frost and shadow, yet its eyes, hollow, unending voids, bored into mine. I staggered back, my scream caught in my throat as the figure dissolved into the gloom. The handprints faded, their presence replaced by a crystalline frost that spread outward, reaching for me like skeletal fingers. I turned and ran, slipping and sliding across the ice, my breaths coming in panicked gasps. The storm seemed to mock me, its howls twisting into mournful laughter that chased me down the road. When I reached my car, I threw myself inside and slammed the door shut, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the ignition. The engine roared to life, and the headlights cut through the snowstorm's veil. I glanced into the rearview mirror and froze. The black sedan was gone. The road behind me was empty, save for the swirling snow. My mind reeled, grasping for an explanation, but there was none. The storm's howls receded as I drove away, though the air in the car remained heavy with the weight of what I had seen. When I reached the next town, I stopped at the first gas station I found, my nerves frayed to the point of breaking. The attendant, an elderly man with weathered features, listened to my tale with a grim expression. "You saw the phantom car," he said at last, his voice heavy with resignation. "The phantom car?" I echoed, my voice barely a whisper. He nodded. "Every winter someone finds it. They say it's the remnant of a family who froze to death on the highway years ago. The driver tried to save them, but the storm took them all. Now their spirits linger, seeking help they'll never receive." His words settled over me like a shroud, their weight suffocating. I left the gas station in silence, the frost still clinging to my skin. Even now, as I write these words, I can feel the phantom car's presence, its cold tendrils reaching for me from the depths of memory. And in the quiet moments when the wind whispers through the cracks, I still hear that voice. "Help me."